If you're watching this video, you are here to learn how to make a realistic bark texture out of clay. Now you can make this out of all sorts of different clays, but in this situation we're going to be using DOS air dry clay. This bark is going to be applied to our Sculpting original log that we have already created and we've already baked to absolute perfection. Now you can find the actual creation of that log and the branches in its own separate video earlier in the series. If you're watching this, it's solely about the actual bark. Now, a lot of this is more so just creating the actual sculpted items, wait them to dry, and then we can kind of put them together as we see fit after we paint them. Now, I do sculpt, paint, and then glue in that process, so that way we make sure that they all fit together absolutely perfectly. We can also paint the bark in different textures if you wanted them to look different or stand out apart from the actual log we've already created. So let's go ahead and get some DOS air dry clay out. Let's take a little bit of patience because it does take a few days for this to dry. And let's just have some fun creating some awesome bark textures here in the studio. Spoiler alert, we will be using some impressions of log textures that I have already taken here in the studio out of Sculpting Original and baked on a separate day. Okay? All right, you guys, let's just jump straight into this awesome content. Now, on a separate day, I had taken some of these impression molds of some bark texture that I already had here in the studio. Now, that was a bunch of dried bark that I've had for a very long time. So, as I stated in a lot of my videos, they were pure of like any kind of like pests or major debris and dirt. And it allowed me to get a really good kind of like impression mold of different kind of bark textures. Now, I didn't get any extremely deep texture rock patterns for this project. I will probably do that again in the future, maybe a secondary or an update to this overall process. But I mainly decided to keep the overall bark texture pretty shallow, and it just makes it a little bit more simplistic. So if somebody were wanting to kind of follow along with this, these kind of impression molds that I made are just a little bit easier to use, and I think that it would be a little bit easier for people out there to reproduce this overall process a little bit easier. I think that if we're using an extremely thick or deep style of bark texture, then I think that it might just be a little bit too difficult for the clay to kind of get down in those grooves and give us a really good impression. And I thought we would have a better overall success rate with this, since I am trying to make this as a kind of a beginner guide portion of this overall project, right? Making bark from clays. Now, again, we've got some of the bark impressions that are the sides of the bark, and then some are the tops, and the tops are different species. So you would want to just use your mind's eye and push the clay in particular ways that just makes you really feel happy with it. Now, as we get into the painting process later, you'll notice again that the overall bark texture is pretty shallow. I'm also doing a lot of tapering on the outside edges of the bark formation into the existing wood textures that we have already on the log, and it's just going to accent it. Now, it doesn't have to look extremely realistic in a lot of ways, because you're going to come back with like paint and flocking later, and maybe even some Mod Podge or spray paint clear coat layers, and a lot of those layers building up kind of it makes it to where you don't have to make everything extremely perfect, right? If you have some imperfections or some of the aspect ratio of the edges of the bark just feel off, then it's okay. It's not the end of the world as far as the project. And like I said, we'll come back later and we will make a deeper gauge of bark later on down the road. So I'll say that we'll let it go, and we're just going to talk about what we have today for this project, right? So, but stay tuned. Make sure you like and subscribe. We'll make something again like this in the future with deeper gauge of bark. Now, here we are. We're going to go ahead and start piecing this together. Now, I don't want a full coverage bark across the entire surface. That's not what I want. And I'm also going to use different tools throughout the process, some like metal curve tools, some dental tools. But a lot of this is literally you just roll out your clay, you apply it in just general forms, and then you just use your impressions to kind of impression the clay however you see fit. Again, this is a white DOS air dry clay, and we're going to let this really chalk over and dry on this saran wrap. Now, why are we using saran wrap, you may ask? Because a lot of these types of air dry clays, not only are they a little bit sticky when they first come out of the containers, but also we don't want any of the dry clay powdered residue to be left behind on that bark surface. Because what we're going to do is we're going to let this dry kind of pretty good on the saran wrap. If you let this dry for an extended amount of time, then of course the entire depth of the clay laying on the saran wrap will be dry. We're going to jump the gun and we're going to peel this up the next day, literally just like 12 hours later. So the underside of this, where it's meeting the saran wrap, is not actually dry. And we're going to get a little bit of curvature, a little bit of warping to it. And in all reality, you'll see here in a little while when it comes off of the saran wrap, it actually is so brittle and so thin that it kind of comes off in segments. I'm not worried about that because I didn't do a full sheet. I'm going to piece it together how I would like to, and then we'll kind of detail paint it from there. But we will be painting it on the actual saran wrap, which means that we can paint it while it's drying. So once it chalks over, we can start to let it dry just a little bit, give us a nice good surface for the paint to adhere to, and then we can immediately start painting it. Because it is an air dry clay and we're using a water-based paint, it can all dry at the same time. But if you do get any kind of cracks, then you need to obviously paint those again. So you'll see, we'll have to do a second touch-up paint layer on it after we kind of glue it all together. But that's not really a big deal. I do kind of like the splotchy look. I didn't want to give a full coverage to where it would cover up all that other underlying beautiful wood texture that I would have sculpted out of the Sculpting original. But I thought that it would be kind of cool. The painting scheme is going to be kind of similar, but just maybe a little bit darker than the underlying wood. And of course, the later on processes of washes and green flocking, things like that, will really change the overall dimension of the bark a little bit and make it feel more realistic. We're also going to put a little bit of that clay on the sides of the log and just make sure that it kind of adheres pretty well so it doesn't just literally fall off. Now, if it were to dry for like a week, then it could easily just dry, kind of contract a little bit, and then it might just peel off this plastic all by itself. You just come in here and you'd randomly find it like laying on the countertop. But as long as it dries in the general shape, then we're going to glue it later with some E6000 or Gorilla Glue. It really doesn't matter as long as it adheres pretty well. Give it that rotation there, and then we're going to go ahead and continue on kind of blending in particular areas and just kind of joining them together. Now, because it's not a full sheet of clay, that's probably why it's a little bit weaker than you would normally see. If I were to roll this out in one huge line of clay, then you wouldn't have an underseam underneath the clay. Because I'm segmenting it together, it means that that under portion of clay where it's meeting the saran wrap is never actually truly blended. And the only thing really holding it together is that portion on the top that we see is blended together. So if you want it to be extremely strong, you would need to roll it out, pat it out, lay it on the saran wrap, and then cut out the segments you want to be voids where you see the wood below. But that's just a different style and a different overall process. I'm making a bunch of these segments of bark texture so I can apply a little bit of this bark texture to the bottom of the diorama around the water feature and things like that, to where it makes it feel like some of the bark had like broken free and is laying down in like the dirt flocking or around the leaves and things like that. It makes it feel more realistic, as far as a lot of the bark has kind of broken away. Where is that bark? Well, it's laying down in the diorama. So we're going to make a few of these little sample size pieces that are going to dry off to the side, and we'll kind of paint them in the overall same theme. I was bringing a small piece down the front branch right there, and in hindsight, that's probably a little bit of a mistake because it's so brittle and so fragile. That does break later, and I do have to glue it back into position, and it's just a little bit too fragile. So yeah, I'm blending the top portions of that clay right there, and then I kind of stipple it with the patterns that we have, but the under portion of that is not blended. So it's just like a clay on clay meeting right there. Now, if you have a dry segment and then you do that with a non-cured wet segment, then you are creating a kind of a like a little bit of a barrier between that dried, dusted, chalked air dry clay and that fresh that you're applying. And sometimes you would get a little bit of separation at those seams. Looking pretty good, right? So it's very simplistic. We didn't go very deep with it. Now we could have went extremely deep, like, you know, 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. We didn't do that this time. This is just at the most maybe 2 centimeters at the deepest part. So it's not fully covering the log either. It's just a nice subtle coverage, just to give us a little bit of variation in texture throughout the process. Now this is the next day. Okay, Saran wrap is still there. The DOS air dry is all in one piece for now. It is one piece for now. I'm gonna pull this up a little bit, and at this point I'm realizing that it's not actually fully cured yet. Well, we'll see. So I was like, let's go ahead and give it another, like, 12 hours or so, and hopefully it'll work out pretty good. I'll go ahead and start painting it because it's a water-based acrylic paint. The water will evaporate and then the item can still dry as it goes. But we are sealing it and with paint, so it does take a little bit extra time for that to fully dry. But because I am kind of just waiting for it to dry a little bit, I have other things to do for the project. Between the base, the water feature, the spider itself, I'm not really worried about an extra few hours to an extra day or two of dry time when it allows me to go ahead and paint it now and expedite that part of the process. Well, so we gave the entire Bart texture, still in the saran wrap again, a whole layer of Mars black and titanium white dry brush. Kind of dry brush. We started with the dark black, like a Mars black, painted the entire surface, seal it, get a good coverage, and then we're going to go ahead and build up those dry brushing layers over that Mars black with titanium white and Mars black together. So a little bit of a dry brush, and the goal is just at the high raised edges of the Bart, not the sides or the taper, or where there'll be like little divots where water or debris could kind of like settle into between the bark and the underlying wood texture. Those need to be dark, but anything that's higher raised needs to be a brighter color, which is that titanium white. Throughout this portion of the project, I'm really just working with the washes to kind of build up some overall shadow and colors before you do any more highlights or more dry brushing. So we're beginning with the burnt umber over majority of the project, and then I'll start to go in with the sepia to kind of blend in some of the, again, recessed edges where water or dirt or snow or any kind of debris in the wilds would settle into, and it would sit there longer than it would sit on the higher raised portions of the, say, bark, because that would just get blown away or washed away. Like water wouldn't really sit on those higher raised portions, but it would settle into all of the, like, the nooks and crannies of kind of recesses under the bark, right? And that's why eventually the bark will dry off and just rot away. It's because debris is getting under there and rotting it out. So here you can see we did go over it with one more kind of a dry brush, and then we kind of started building up our burnt umber layers here. Now I'm going to remove it from the saran wrap, or, well, I think I am. So I flip it over here and I'm peeling off the saran wrap, which actually is not as bad of a process as I thought it was going to be. I thought it would be a little bit more adhered than it is, and it actually stuck more to the acrylic paint that I overpainted than it had actually the DOS air dry. And you can see, because I didn't seam or blend those under seams where it was meeting the saran wrap, we have just a lot of separation between these segments. Now, it's not the end of the world. This looks really good. It looks very, very deep and rich, and you're seeing a lot of variation in the overall shades because of the way we kind of dry brush the higher raised portions, and we let the underside portions or the divots stay dark. Now, so of course it's coming apart in little segments, and I just have to remember where they go. That's it. Just remember where they go, so that way we can reassemble them at the exact same way on the item. Now, we're going to be using the E6000. I do feel like the E6000 just dries a little bit faster than the Gorilla Glue, but I do also feel like Gorilla Glue is a stronger overall adhesive. So it depends on which situation you have, depends on how you're going to, which one you want to use. We're going to go ahead and start to layer this bark texture in here. Now I don't want to apply so much glue that it separates and allows some of that glue to run out or squish out of the sides. We don't want that, but we do want to make sure we flood the bottom of it enough to where it gives a really good adhesion between not just where it's making contact with the log, but also where it's making contact with the bark segments coming together. So you can see how I'm really just pushing those segments together, trying to make sure that none of that bleached out DOS Airdry clay is visible through any of that paint. And if we don't get a perfect fit for whatever reason, maybe a shrinkage, or maybe I just have them in the wrong position, then I'll come in with the detailing paint layer after the fact and just kind of like tidy things up between the seams. That's no problem. And I also plan to come in with a Mod Podge clear coat later in the end games of this project, just kind of seal in the log, make sure all the green and dirt flockings are kind of like locked into position and they're not going to shift around during the shipping process. And it also gives the overall log just a very wet texture, because it's supposed to be in the Amazon rainforest, or any kind of like heavy humidity zones. Or even if it came out of a terrarium, I believe that those terrariums would have a higher humidity point than natural air. So the log would probably be a little bit damp and like old looking and things like that. Now the pieces here, we're just really not holding tight against the log. So I do apply a little bit of rubber band action here. Oh yeah, use what you have at your fingertips. And the rubber bands are a lifesaver when it comes to stuff like this. So it's going to hold on to it, and it's just going to like hold them into position. I'll babysit it for a few minutes, and then I'm just going to go to bed and just let it happen. Whatever happens to it, happens to it. I'm also going to try to make sure that none of the glue or adhesive is like squishing out of the sides and give me big drips around the edges of the bark. I don't want all that. So if I put any kind of drips there, it would be my decision, not because the glue just happens to be squishing out. All right, looking pretty good. Now that piece on the front branch is just very fragile, and I do have to put a lot of adhesive underneath it, because I just do not want that thing to break away. And because it is on the front of the item, it's just gonna have a lot of eyes on it, and it's got to look good. It's got to look good. So we're just make sure that it blends as much as possible. And I actually have to take it off, put more adhesive on it, and then try to attach it again. It's supposed to go underneath that piece on the upper portion of the log. So I need to lift that up and then settle this down on that piece of bark texture. It needs to be seamless. There is also glue between the actual segment, the small segment, and the large segment. And then here it is up to this point in the video, and we're actually going to roll into some bonus content. Who's excited? Okay, you know that you like it so far. There's a lot of distinguishing texture to it. It looks really good on the existing kind of tones of the existing wood formation of the log. Now, again, that is Sculpting original. We oven baked that. And now we're going to go into the bonus material, where I'm just applying with Mod Podge a little bit of that green flocking there. I also have a few of those handcrafted clay leaves. We also made those out of DOS Airdry clay, and we used leaf impressions to create those. Very cool. And you can find that video in the info card right there if you're looking for something different. Instead of bark, it's leaves. And we're going to go ahead and go over this with a nice layer of this beautiful green flocking. We will also dye that with some washes along the way, and then we'll also seal it in with some Mod Podges in the end game. So if you get any like small cracks that just look out of place for whatever reason, a lot of times that Mod Podge, nice flood coat with a brush, will kind of fill in any of those weakened segments that may be exposing cracks or underlying problems. We are going to really lay the green flocking on pretty heavily here, just because it pops so well against those existing brown colors. Making sure to get the butt of the log there. And now, of course, I'll come back and tidy it up after this content is created here. But just be aware, you can see how vibrant the overall log has become with just one layer of green flocking, and it looks really good. I didn't put a ton of shrubbery and greenery right here on this one branch, because that's where the actual spider is going to be sitting. So a little bit is okay, but I don't want to get any kind of flocking where the item is going to be making contact with the centerpiece, which is the spider. Here it is in all its glory, looking absolutely spectacular. Now make sure you check out the full length content, which I will link here. Not to mention, I'm working on this awesome purple Goliath Birdeater now, so make sure you check out the full video on that as well. It's about an hour long of awesome crafting glory. Catch you later, guys.